Hi, I'm Dr. Janice Webb. I'm a clinical psychologist in the Boston area and author of two books, Running on Empty, Overcome Your Childhood Emotional Neglect, which came out in 2012, and my brand new book, which just came out November of 2017, is called Running on Empty No More, Transform Your Relationships with Your Partner, Your Parents, and Your Children. And that book is also about emotional neglect in families. And I'm here today with my friend and colleague, Ross Rosenberg. He is from the Chicago area, an author, writer, speaker. And Ross and I met because our paths kept crossing, because our work is kind of similar, yet very different. And we kind of speak to two different groups. But we thought we should get together and talk about what's similar between our two approaches and what's different. And then we thought, why not record it, right? Because my people, I think, will benefit from Ross's work, and perhaps Ross's work would benefit from my work as well. Ross's people would benefit from my work. So, hi, Ross.
Well, hey, Janice.
After all that, do you want to say something about yourself and your brand new book, which is just coming out?
Well, sure. But first, I want to say how pleased I am at doing this project, because you are right that it was by accident that we met. I believe, and a client of mine asked me during a session as I was explaining to her some of my thoughts about where her codependency and self-love deficit disorder came from. She goes, I read this book by Dr. And she couldn't remember your name, but she remembered the name of your book, and so I Googled it. And she goes, I think that your stuff and her stuff is really similar. And then I thought, okay, that's kind of cool, and got me a little bit nervous. So then I kind of Googled you, found out, who you are. I read a little bit about you. And I thought, wow, we are talking about similar things, but explaining it differently. And because over the last year and a half, we've kept up this this dialogue, this collaboration, and built a friendship. I am really happy to do this video with you, because it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, thank you. Same here. And I've had the same experiences where people say to me, I know what you're talking about. It's self-love deficit. And of course, that's you. So would you describe a little bit about your book? Because I just read it, and it's fantastic. It's not out yet, people, is it? Right?
Well,
when did it come out?
Well, so yes and no. So I wrote the book, The Human Magnet Syndrome, Why We Love People Who Hurt Us, 6 years ago. And like any first author, as soon as I wrote it, I realized, there was all this stuff that I wanted to say that I should have said. And 6 years later, I had an opportunity to put together all of my thoughts and ideas into a bigger book. So I just published, well, it's going to be published in the 3 or 4 weeks, my second book called The Human Magnet Syndrome, The Codependent Narcissist Trap. And I talk about everything that I did in the first book, but I've expanded it greatly and added all sorts of new information. And essentially, it's about why people fall in love with someone that feels so right and so perfect, and ends up being so difficult and so harmful. And I use the explanation of codependence, people who are caregivers, people who are altruistic, people who are patient. They're always falling in love with selfish people who are narcissists. So that's just a little bit of my book. And maybe in this conversation, we can talk about it more in detail, but I don't want to go on and on about it.
Okay. Yeah, it's really interesting because you're talking about self-love deficit disorder, which is coming more, I think, in another book that you're planning to write. But it's mentioned in this first book. And my books are both about childhood emotional neglect, which is essentially just what happens when parents don't respond enough to their children's emotions. And it just makes the child grow up being very out of touch with his or her own emotions. And I would imagine, you know, in my work, I talk a lot about all that stuff, but it seems like that's probably a part of what makes a person attracted to narcissistic types.
Absolutely. Just for clarification, the first book, I had not, what I had done is I didn't like the terminology codependency. So what I did was I kind of redefined it. And that's the Human Magnet Syndrome redefines codependency. In my later works, I renamed codependency to self-love deficit disorder. And we can talk more about that later, but I wanted to address what you just said, is that in my books, I understand codependency and pathological narcissism, or self-love deficit disorder and narcissism, to come from attachment trauma, which is a childhood. It is being raised by a neglectful, sometimes abusive parent, often a narcissist, and it disrupts, severely disrupts or traumatizes the child early during their formative years. And it seems that you and I have very similar understanding, but different ways of describing the same thing. So I find it really interesting how our theories, our homegrown theories, kind of intersect and are similar. And what I'd like to share with you is a really simple way of understanding my concept of codependency being a symptom that comes from childhood attachment trauma. And it's through, and if you can imagine a pyramid, and the pyramid has 5 levels. Codependency is a symptom that's on the top of the pyramid. At the very bottom, the foundation, is the childhood trauma. From that comes core shame, and that is the feeling of being fundamentally not good enough or broken. From the core shame is, I call, pathological loneliness, which is this pervasive feeling of not feeling good in your own skin, not feeling happy, needing someone to make you feel good about yourself. And from loneliness is this addiction, this need to make the pain go away, because the loneliness is very, very painful. So I call that codependency addiction. And from that is the symptom of codependency. So at the very core of my work is a description of, we bring into our adulthood our dysfunctional relationship patterns that come from our childhood, that if we're going to understand them and solve them, we have to go all the way back to what happened to us in our childhood.
Oh yeah, that's a really good description. And I'm sure anyone who is a clinician and watching this will say, yes, yes, yes. I've seen that plenty of times. But it does take someone who sees all those things and puts the right words to it in a way that it makes sense to people is really valuable.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. I think that as you were talking, I was thinking about how my concept of childhood emotional neglect fits with that, or doesn't. And what I was thinking about is that because not everyone who has childhood emotional neglect grows up to have that sort of addictive pull that you're describing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because part of what I'm trying to convey to people is that you don't have to have a trauma, that it doesn't have to be, something really painful or traumatic that happens in your childhood. It can just be parents who aren't paying enough attention emotionally.
Right.
And if you grow up with, there's every level of that. And if you grow up with just enough of it that crosses a certain threshold, that you grow up feeling just sort of empty and kind of disconnected, and like you're sort of alone in the world, even when you're surrounded by people, like you never fit in. And also some shame. But I get the feeling that it doesn't necessarily reach the point that you're.
Well,
identifying.
I think, first of all, I think this is fascinating because I think if we look at a problem, because I love continuums, but if we look at it, as a matter of a continuum, my work explains a serious psychological disorder, which is called self-love deficit disorder, aka codependency.
Mm-hmm.
And it also explains the birth or the origins of personality disorders. And so I'm focused primarily on psychopathology.
Mm-hmm.
What I like about your work is yours explains it from a non-pathological, non-super dysfunctional point of view, so more people can appreciate it, learn from it, and benefit from it. My work, the people that tend to read my stuff or watch my videos have very serious problems and are in super dysfunctional relationships. So I think our work really meshes because, first of all, they don't contradict each other, which is cool.
Not at all. They confirm each other.
Yeah, but yours is more general and probably has a much more of a general application in the world, and mine is more specific to to this codependency self-love deficit disorder thing.
Yeah. Well, I think we've solved it now. I mean, that's it. Nothing more to say.
The world needs us both. Damn it.
I was hoping to knock you out today.
Oh, shoot.
Get you out of the picture. No, I'm kidding.
I know you are.
Of course. Yeah, I think that's really in a nutshell how we're different. But I have to say that I have a lot of people that I end up working with on their childhood emotional neglect who end up in relationships, because people with childhood emotional neglect tend to take up little space. They're
Right.
just sort of like, it's not necessarily obvious and it's not to a point of serious pathology necessarily at all, but nevertheless, they just don't feel like they deserve to take up as much space as everyone else does. So they can really attract people who are more comfortable taking up a lot of space.
Right.
And be very comfortable in that. And in fact, I mentioned that in my new book, and I mentioned your book in my new book, because I think that when the people that I'm working with get to a point that they keep finding themselves in dysfunctional relationships like that with people that take up a lot of space,
Mm-hmm.
then they need to really learn about your work and start doing some of that.
It's interesting. There's a lot of really, really good people such as yourself that do not like to throw labels out, and I even addressed that in my new book, the necessity for labels and the danger of labels. And I appreciate the fact that you are not rushing to put a label on one side or the other, but I do, so I own it. And so the people that you describe as taking up a lot of space, I refer as narcissists, and the people taking up a little space as codependents. But I created what I call is my relationship compatibility continuum that represents people as caregivers, healthy ones, or as very pathological ones as codependent, or people who are more on the selfish side as being, okay and not so dysfunctional and being very pathological. So I like the way that you use the word taking up space. So I'm curious, could you tell me and the viewers more about what that person looks like and what, what's a typical person with CEN who feels like they take up very little space?
Sure, that's a great question. Well, people with, and I see these people in my office all the time. It's almost my full practice at this point. Plus in my online program, I work with a lot. So I've, got a really good picture of what this looks like. And all of these people have this in common, that they just don't quite feel comfortable asking for things. I call it counter-dependent, that they don't feel comfortable depending on another person. And that's because their emotional needs were so thwarted when they were growing up that they learned to just keep it all to themselves. So they tend to be uncomfortable speaking up, being like just taking up space, meaning if you see a CEN person, they don't usually, sit spread out. They sit more, close in. All of this doesn't apply to everyone, of course, but in general, you can almost, like, I'm at a point where I can spot it in people pretty quickly, and I know exactly how they feel, and I get it, and my heart goes out to them. It's pretty amazing.
So it seems to me that my evolution from codependency away from that term, which is, I think, a derogatory and a pejorative term, into something that is more descriptive of the person's internal state, self-love deficit.
Yep.
To me, I see a similarity between this person, this CEN individual, who feels, paradoxically, I assume, more comfortable taking up little space. That's the same personality type of the person with self-love deficit disorder, who, because they never learned to love themselves, they feel they have to defer to the rest of the world. They have to mute their own voice and become, and I use this in my book, they have to become the wallpaper sometimes of the room, so that no one really pays too much attention to them.
Yeah. It's like, I've heard the word wallflower used to describe people describe themselves as wallflowers who have childhood emotional neglect. So it's kind of funny, those two fit together so well. But what's interesting too is that the people that I work with and come across don't understand why people don't see them. Like, they feel invisible and they feel really hurt by that, and they don't realize that they're making themselves invisible because it's just bred into them. It's like wired in.
Well, and what happens is this goes all the way back to the attachment trauma. And by the way, I was hugely influenced by the book by Alice Miller, The Drama
of the Gifted Child. Yes.
Absolutely.
Drama. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I credit her work with inspiring some of mine. But I mean, the child from a narcissist during its attachment, and Bowlby, famous attachment theorist, talks about this. Children need nurturing in order to become healthy adults, psychologically and relationally. And if you are starved of nurturing, or there's no attachment, it's like you grow up in this desert of this environment, and children figure out how to survive. And if you were raised around narcissists who aren't very friendly or nice, you find out that when you're wallpaper or a wallflower, or you take up little space, you're safer that way. And that becomes fused into your self-concept, your self-esteem. And when you become an adult, that's all you know, because during that formative time in your life, you didn't get the experience to learn about how safe it is to be bold and creative and independent.
Yes. And it's interesting because so many people that have childhood emotional neglect don't reach that level where they where it's a trauma, and instead it's more that, the way that I view it anyway, what happens, the process is that the parents might actually be good people and there's no narcissism even in the parents. However, the parents are just emotionally blind because they were raised that way themselves.
Right.
So no one noticed their emotions growing up. So they don't notice their children's emotions growing up. And because when a child's emotions aren't noticed, the child receives a very loud, never stated, but very clear message: your emotions don't matter. And then the child pushes his or her emotions, just walls them off, so they won't be a problem, and then goes through their lives devoid of this amazing resource that the rest of us all enjoy, their emotions.
So what we have in common is that what happens to us in childhood impacts our emotional health as an adult, And again, I want to go back to what I said earlier. What I like about your work is that you don't pathologize it, and so that includes so many more people than my work. And you're not also as judgmental as I am. and I am who I am, and people like it or not. But I'm this diagnostic type of guy, and if someone has the symptoms, I call them that disorder. And some people aren't that way. So
I think there's a lot of value in that, because labels help. I mean, you and I have both come up with labels for what we're discovering and what we're working on. I came up with childhood emotional neglect, and you came up with the human magnet syndrome and SLD and SLDD. So those are all labels, and it helps people to have a name for what they're struggling with, right?
Absolutely. And you know what? What's great about people like you and hopefully me too, is that we find our niche, and everyone has a different way that they process their world, their problems. And so some people might read my work and go, well, I'm not a codependent, and my parents aren't a narcissist. And then they'll pick up your book and go, oh yeah, this really relates. And or vice versa is, that they'll want something a little bit more whatever I do. So what's great is because your book has sold thousands and thousands of books, like 60, 70,000 books. So you've hit on a nerve. So people really relate to your work. And so I think we're talking about similar concepts, but we're using terminologies and theories that they package them differently and resonate differently to different people. So more people get helped.
Exactly, which I think is what's so great. And this is why we keep coming across each other so much in our work, which is really neat. Because
if you don't know who you are, if you don't know why you are, psychotherapy doesn't work. It's just a Band-Aid. So you and your work, you have an explanation. You are this way because this happened to you. More than likely it happened to your parents. And so now that we know what happened, the what's and the whys, the psychotherapy has a chance of working. And that's what I admire about your work. Versus someone who just says, well, codependency is, you have to say no, you have to set boundaries, but they don't go deeper into the explanation of what happened. So the fact that you have an explanation, a theory, and techniques, I think that's fantastic. And there's just not enough people who do that. Well, thank you. That's high praise coming from someone who I feel like has identified a really valuable thing that goes wrong for many, many people, which is you. You've done that, which I think is just fantastic. I hope lots of people that watch this video and identify with my work will think about whether your work will help them. So Janice, tell me more about, tell me more, if you can't, what I'd love to hear is you to kind of encapsulate your old book and then tell me about your new book. And because I'm pretty excited about it. In fact, I think I even wrote something about You okay. did. I wrote an endorsement. Yes. You did. Thank you. I appreciate that. So I was going to tease you a little bit. But I would love to hear you say, hey, this is what I did, and now this is what I wrote, because I want to hear more about it, and I bet a lot of other people do. Oh, okay, great. Yeah, so my first book was introducing the concept of childhood emotional neglect and some of the things I just talked about a little bit a few minutes ago, how it happens and how it affects the child. And it also walks people through different exercises to do to start getting back in touch with their emotions and start standing up for themselves more. And it has a lot of a lot of examples. My second book, which is called Running on Empty No More, Transform Your Relationships, is taking that concept of emotional neglect and applying it to a person's relationships. Mm-hmm. Because when you have CEN, or childhood emotional neglect, it causes you to be a certain way in relationships. You take up less space. Right. You have trouble asking for things.
speaking up for yourself. Your relationships tend to be more about the other person than yourself. And so in this book, I'm addressing the second book. I'm addressing how to change that in your relationships. So the first book is about yourself. The second book is about how to heal childhood emotional neglect that's weighing on your marriage,
Right.
that's standing between you and your parents. Because once you realize your parents emotionally neglected you, it makes you feel very differently about them than you used to. And it's also about how to make sure you don't pass childhood emotional neglect down to your children, because it does just automatically blind spot to emotion. You raise your children blind to their emotions. And
Right.
so the last third of the book is about parenting and how to heal it with adult children, adolescents, and small children.
That's a nice wide spectrum of talking about what it is, how it impacts you, and how not to pass it down. That's kind of cool. And again, I admire that because you're giving people the information they need and the solutions.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I feel like it's a very complete sort of theory that covers, what causes it, what's it like to live with it, and how do you heal it in yourself and with all the people in your life. So that's my goal. I hope I've achieved that.
It's interesting because I always looked at my work as having two sides, and the human magnet syndrome is what I call the what and the why material. And the first book was about 170 pages. The second book is about almost 300. And because I feel so strongly that about the idea that you can't solve a problem if you don't know exactly what it is, I put my heart and soul into that book. But the next book I'm going to write, which is information I already have on professional, I have a website or a company called Self-Love Recovery Institute, and I sell my full-length seminar videos. And so I have a lot of material on what I call the codependency cure. And that is my how-to material. So my first and second book tells people what the problem is. And my next book is going to be the solution. And people need that. And I can't tell you how many times people would raise their hand in my seminars and say, okay, I get it. I get the human magnet syndrome, but so what do I do? I would have to say.
And you would say, watch for my next book.
Almost like that. But I would say that, and I would say that's at least a 6-hour training, and I'm going to be doing that. And so I stayed focused, and I didn't let my focus move out of what I wanted to do. And so now I have both sides, and that's why I appreciate what you do, because you have all the sides involved. Because as much as people want to know what the problem is, they still need direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm looking forward to your next book to see what you're going to talk about. I think it's really going to be interesting.
Well, if you're interested, and you have proof, because I'm saying this way out in internet land where everyone can hear it, is you can have a free registration to my trainings in Chicago, February 12th and 13th.
Ooh.
And
thank you.
in Skokie, Illinois. But I am actually, I've been giving the seminar on the codependency cure work for almost 4 years now, and have probably 18 hours worth of seminar videos at my store. But I haven't given a live version in a while, and I'm going to be doing that in February in my close to where I live. Skokie, Illinois is not too far from Chicago.
Oh, wow. That's really neat. Cool. So you're going to be doing it in person?
Yep. I used to do that all the time. And then my wife and I decided no more. And so now I maybe 3-4 times a year I travel. Sometimes I get invited to speak.
I wanted to say to everyone watching that if you think it's possible that childhood emotional neglect could be at work in your life, but you're not sure because, you know, most people aren't sure. It's invisible to many people, not very memorable when it happens. So if you're curious, you can go to my website, which is emotionalneglect.com, and take the Childhood Emotional Neglect Questionnaire. It's free, and it will also sign you up to receive my newsletter, which I send out once a week and is loaded with information about CEN and how to recover from it.
Wow, once a week? You're busy.
Yes, I am. It's fun though. I love it. So what would do you have anything what would you like to say before we sign off?
Absolutely. Well, I'd like for people to consider buying my new book, The Human Magnet Syndrome, The Codependent Narcissist Trap. It has my latest thinking and information on the subject. If you want more information about self-love deficit disorder, or what I call self-love recovery, which is the pursuit of, it's how you, the opposite of self-love deficit is self-love abundance, and that's how we get healthier. But all of my work can be seen at selfloverecovery.com. And if you have any questions, just shoot me an email. And I also have a YouTube channel, so just go to YouTube and type in Ross Rosenberg, and I should pop up. I think there's only one of me that talks about this stuff. But what I want to say is my way of closing, and then I'll be curious on what you have to say, is, you know, life is too short. I mean, we didn't get a chance to pick our parents. Our parents didn't pick their parents. So we have to deal with the cards that were dealt to us. And it's not too late, and I'm going to quote George Eliot, it's not too late to become the person we always wanted to be. And we just have to believe in ourselves, and we just have to put forth the effort and keep optimistic and hopeful, and we can solve this self-love deficit disorder problem. And so whether it's through my work or it's through your work, don't give up. And how would you like to close our video?
I would like to add to what you just said, that every single person who does that, who heals themselves, is also healing everyone around them and making a difference for the future. You know, future generations, because what we do now affects our children and their children and their children.
Right.
Yeah.
That's how true. In fact, I have a YouTube video that I just posted that is on that. I call it's the codependency baton. Stop passing it on.
Oh, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to your video, and we should do this more often. This was a lot of fun.
I agree, Ross. Thank you very much.
And we'll talk soon.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.